From in the beginning to the musical apocalypse, this is The Bible Says What? I'm your host, Mike Wiseman. Before we begin today's regularly scheduled program, I would like to thank Christina Hill for her patronage and for her comment about the show being better than any sermon she's ever heard. Thanks, Christina. You too could be immortalized into BSW history. Simply go to patreon.com/BSW the podcast and sign up to be a supporter of the show. That being said, Darth Vader is a documented child killer. Countless people love this iconic Star Wars character. Adults and children alike dress up like him for Halloween, conventions, and even at bedtime. They wear shirts, shoes, and even pins that represent Darth Vader. But he's a documented child killer. After watching him lightsaber so many kids, I've always cringed a little seeing children wear clothes with Darth Vader on them. Yes, it can be said that just before his death, this mass murderer's heart grew 2 sizes bigger. None of which excuses his actions against the young Jedi or the countless others he slaughtered along the way. Now, there may be some that have chosen to worship this character, but I'm sure the numbers are pretty low on that one. Christians, on the other hand, have completely thrown in their lot with their own personal child-killing character. They worship him and teach others to do the same. They'll even threaten someone with eternal hellfire for not worshiping their particular child killer. Personally, I don't think anyone should worship anyone or anything, especially fictional characters that slaughter children. Let's start the show.
Is there anything in the Bible that you yourself have an issue with? Okay, so it took you reading the Bible to realize that those things were bad for you?
Yeah, it actually did. I
didn't figure this out on your own?
No, Ted Bundy could be redeemed. God doesn't kill children.
What do you think the Passover was? Yahweh sets up a whole system in the Old Testament where you slaughter animals just so he's able to forgive you.
Today's special guest is pastor and podcaster Kevin Sweeney. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Oh, man, I appreciate it, dude. Happy to be here. We got a little 3-hour time difference, not too big. So we're close in what the time of the day it is. So, man, thank you so much for taking the time. And I've been telling people, truly, as a first-time author, without seeing me on other podcasts and seeing me connected with people, you're like, oh, that makes sense for me and that sounds great. I appreciate you like taking the risk and inviting me on. Like, so I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking the risk and coming on the show. So let's talk a little bit about your podcast. How's it going? What's it called?
Oh, man.
What do you do?
Yeah. Podcast is called The Church Needs Therapy. And, that's one of those things where, I'm aware, kind of like the subtitle of my book, which maybe we'll get into depending on where this goes, where I'm a lover of words and
author as well. Sorry,
yes,
I didn't throw that in there.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
And, the intrigue of, the church needs therapy, and my cover art is very bold where you can see that. And it's funny and it's clever, but it's also real in the sense of people only go to, the only people who go to therapy are ones who still have some form of hope left. Because if you didn't have any hope for that tomorrow can be different from today, if you didn't believe in the possibility of transformation or a further experience of joy or lightness or peace, or however somebody would name their experience, they wouldn't go. So for me, with whatever critiques I have of all of the different expressions of the church, especially in our own country and where we're at, that is a podcast that says, but there's still the possibility of growth and evolution and becoming wider and more hopeful and a more beautiful and a more inclusive version of where some of us hope this path is going. So it's fun. Half of it is me doing my own teachings. The other half is bringing on guests like this. So yeah, it's fun. It's also a great way just for me to connect with people because I'm so geographically disconnected. So yeah, it's been fun, man. It's been fun.
Well, that's what it's like living in paradise out there. Holy cow, man.
Yeah, there's a price to live in paradise. It's very expensive. And also we're very disconnected from a lot of the 24-hour news cycle for a lot of other people isn't the same here. Where people can be still socially and politically aware, but the culture, and we have so much of our own things that happen here in Hawaii, and it's such a unique place culturally, and there's so much that happens here that no one knows about on the mainland, that for us it's yes, like technically we're in the United States of America, but we have a different flow and pace of life, and we're not as wrapped up in the 24-hour news cycle here. So we're connected, but still distinct. So
it's a whole other environment. That's for sure. I've been there once
Absolutely.
as a kid, man. Miss it. It was awesome.
Totally.
Didn't you guys have like a missile warning or something recently?
Yeah, I want to say that was maybe 4 years ago or something.
It feels like forever.
I'm in right now this building called the Collection. So if I move this camera, the listeners, this is not good for you at all. This is like downtown Honolulu, this harbor, and there's an ocean right there.
Amazing. Wow.
And so I'm on the 37th floor of this building. So where I live in Kaka'ako, it's like the unofficial arts district right outside Honolulu. It's the urban core of Honolulu. Towers, condos, everything you can imagine in like a city environment. And we were on the 40th floor when that happened, and it was like missile, like panicking. My wife was across the street where there's like a outdoor kind of shopping social retail space. We hit each other up like our building's putting us in the stairwell.
Oh wow!
Like, it was like there might have been sirens going off because they have tsunami warnings here.
Yeah.
There was like a 15-20 minute stretch where people were like barricading themselves.
Man, that's so scary. Holy cow, man!
And then like everything else, in the end, everyone knows, oh, nothing happened. That's why we get tsunami warnings here, or like a hurricane warning. There's going to be a big hurricane. Usually they veer off. And it's like, this is the peak of hurricane warning, and people are just surfing and just hanging out at the beach. Like, we've been
It's a whole different world out there. That's for sure.
Yeah.
You mean there's going to be big waves? Grab the boards. Let's go.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's so much fun, man. Well, back to the fun stuff here. So pastor, how long have you been pastoring?
My wife and I started our church called Imagine almost 10 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So we had like this neighborhood we live in. I knew about plans for this neighborhood before we moved back to Hawaii about 10 years ago. And, it just represented this thin slice of the culture here in Honolulu, where it is kind of like the neighborhood that they're shaping for the future, where it's urban island culture. It's like anything you can imagine in a city. There's the microbreweries and the coffee shops, and we have a big street art festival that comes here once a year. So our whole neighborhood's filled with murals everywhere. So
wow.
I just thought at that point, like tracing where the culture is going in so many ways and where the church is at, people like myself, I'm not alone in this process, would look at a city like that and say, these new cultural spaces require new, more liberated imaginations for the future. People who are not trying to recreate the past, but people who are trying to create the future, not by forgetting the past, but by continuing the further unfolding, right? It's not to go recreate the same fire as 500 years ago. It's to take that same spark and to build and to create this new flame where we are. And we just said, man, there's this new space that requires a new pastoral imagination. And that's kind of what we lived into the past 10 years in this neighborhood. And it's been amazing. Yeah.
Huh. Is that where the Imagine name comes from?
Imagine, actually, that's a good question. There is this theologian who I love named Walter Brueggemann. And Walter Brueggemann, he wrote a book in 1978 called The Prophetic Imagination. And he's continued to build on that concept forever. And his main thesis, almost for me, for like all of his writing career, is the prophetic imagination, like the prophets in the Old Testament he's looking at, and Jesus as well, is saying, he says the prophet is a person who speaks a new future into existence for people in the present that exists beyond their current boundaries of imagination. And he says by imagining a new future, he invites new social possibilities in the present. So the prophet begins with creativity and imagination. Things can be different. There can be more justice. There can be more equality. There can be more inclusivity. There can be more, et cetera, et cetera. And when the prophet imagines that and people have the vision, we then return to the present and say, how do we start building, working for that, creating some holy trouble, disrupting the present moment so we can build towards that future. So Imagine was our version of doing that for the church here.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What brought you to be a pastor to begin with? Was because I talked to a lot of pastors, and some of them it's a calling. Some people they had a feeling. What was it for you?
I have a part of the book is, it's me sharing defining moments in my own story, right? So, the book, for people listening, it's called The Making of a Mystic, and the subtitle is, gosh, I can't remember right now. It is My Journey with Mushrooms, My Life as a Pastor, and Why It's Okay for Everyone to Relax.
There you go.
And so I mean, come on now. And I have a chapter in the book called Mushrooms and Missionaries. And it's about how psychedelic mushrooms were like missionaries in my life. Because I wasn't involved in, I went to like Catholic school as a first, second, third grader and stopped going to mass after with my family. And they didn't push it on me, which I'm really grateful for. They just kind of let me be. And when I was a teenager, like I'm sure like if you talk to a lot of pastors, there are a lot of times in podcasts, like very evangelical-ish, and they're in youth groups and they're in all those experiences and they go to the church camps. I didn't know anything about any of that at all. I wasn't in that world as a teenager at all. And I started eating mushrooms when I was 16, and they started having this like guiding role for me in my life. Like I tell a story in the book where Thomas Merton, who's one of the great mystics and Catholics and contemplatives of the 20th century, early on in his awakening days, I mean, this is probably like the 30s at this point, there was this visiting Hindu monk, this well-known priest who was coming to the States, and I think he was going to be lecturing at divinity schools or something. So this young Thomas Merton, his name is Mahanambrata Brahmachari. So this young Merton, a young
That's
white
a mouthful.
guy.
I can't believe you just said it so fast. That's amazing.
At the end, I'm gonna quiz you on that. All right? and the other Hawaiian word and the Hawaiian words that I say. And so Merton, this young white kid, goes up to him and asks him for guidance. And this brilliant Hindu monk, interestingly enough, doesn't point a young Merton to the Bhagavad Gita or his own sacred text. He tells Merton to read St. Augustine's Confessions, Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, these well-known Catholic writers. And I tell people, let's say Merton reads those, integrates them into his journey, and becomes this profound, prophetic, disruptive, amazing Christian author in the 20th century. I say, I don't think in that Hindu monk's job description, he had being a missionary for Jesus in his job description, right?
I don't think that's how that works.
if you take the word missionary, and let me just, for your listeners, I'm going to temporarily suspend the urgent need to disentangle that word missionary from its white supremacist, colonial, empire building, expansion, culturally degrading, et cetera, not that it's tied up in, because it is. And I hope for people listening and who care about the church or who are familiar with that term, I hope we're all dismantling all of those unhealthy, toxic forms of that. So, but the good part is, now that we're back here, I have my own version of that in my life that I'm doing. But the healthy part of that term is, okay, a missionary is someone who's pointing someone further towards Christ, towards the source, towards truth, towards life. That's a good thing.
Hope.
And yeah, towards hope, exactly.
Which we'll talk about. I'm very curious about where you get your hope and where you get your hope. But go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead. And so if that's the case, that Hindu monk was a missionary for Christ, for Merton. And in the same way, mushrooms were a missionary for me, pointing me beyond themselves towards life, towards hope, towards the source, like you said.
I love that we just went to mushrooms. This is amazing. I don't think we've touched much on that except for the mushroom pizza episode. So mushrooms.
So the reason I tell that, to come back around to your original question, the pastoral thing was, this is all in the book. I have these parts of I have chunks of my life in the book, and I have these experiences. I keep doing mushrooms. I feel them calling me beyond them to something true, to the sourre, to whatever. I finally had this profound awakening moment with God when I was 18 while I was on mushrooms that completely re-altered my life, rewired my consciousness, and reshaped my future. And to this day, my pastoral calling, my whole life with God, is and always will be a response to that moment.
Wow.
So a couple years later, I had this sense of, I feel like God's calling me to be a pastor. And then the funny thing is like, I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know people said that really. I didn't know about that. It was, and I think the substance of that was the desire to be a guide for others.
To be a guide.
I've seen this. I've been liberated in this unique way. I'm on this further path towards joy, towards more peace, except towards more courage and bravery and creativity, whatever it is. And my natural response is to want to help guide others and wake. Sometimes the spiritual teacher is just an alarm clock inviting people to wake up. And I think my response is to that. Yeah.
Interesting way to put it. I like that.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah.
So these mushrooms, no, this is amazing. I love this. Your church, do you either use mushrooms or promote the use of mushrooms, or how's that work in your church?
Yeah, that's a good question. From that moment, from the time I was 16 to when I had that first initial encounter with God when I was 18, I did mushrooms 10 times. And so that was my 10th time when I did them.
10th
and I never did mushrooms again after that. You know, Alan Watts, who's the famous, 20th century teacher that a lot of people who are more, the spiritual but not religious folks, seeking awakening outside the church, no judgment there. Everyone has a unique path. But Alan Watts is one of their guys, know, and he has this famous line, and there's more to the quote where he says, when you get the message, hang up the phone. He says, psychedelic drugs are simply instruments like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. And he's like, the biologist does not sit with the eye permanently glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen. And the reason why I bring that up is that's what happened to me. I felt the mushrooms calling me beyond them to the source. And when I encountered the source for myself, like I tell people, the mushrooms, the ocean is God, love, grace, acceptance, etc. So once they lead me to the ocean, I don't need the directions anymore. I don't need the signs anymore. My goal after that is to learn what it means to live in the ocean and trust the ocean and become the ocean myself. To me, to go back to the directions would be going backwards. Why would I go back? I don't need the Apple map anymore. I'm already here. Now it's silence and solitude and these practices that keep me grounded in the ocean for the rest of my life. So I always, even at 18, when people have big peak experiences, whether they're on mushrooms or they go to a Christian camp or they go to like Burning Man or they're doing Molly at Coachella with their friends, there's many different versions of these things. When it's over, like you're like, I discovered the truth of everything. You have these moments. And then by next Friday, you feel the same. And it's frustrating because we desire change and we really want that. And I know that. And then the most natural response for people is to go back and try to recreate the experience that led them to there in the first place. Let's do more drugs. No, let's go to let's pay $500 for another Christian conference. No, let's go back to this thing. Let's do sound baths now. And there's nothing, I'm not like dissing any one of those things, but for me, it was, no, we don't try to go back and recreate the experience. The point is to keep going further on what we've already seen and to become that which we've seen over there. So,
and you don't need the mushrooms to continue that. You're good. You've had it. You've had your experience. You're done there. So.
Exactly. And so that was my thing at 18 was like I felt even maybe 6 months later when a part of me thinks, man, I want to do mushrooms again, just because they feel so good and they're so awesome. And I want to trip out and I want to do all that. But then the other part of me is like, those were like Alan Watts said, those were the instrument that furthered me, that called me beyond them, and to go back to them. And this is not like a pastor telling me this. To me, it was like, that would be to betray the source of love and God that has accepted me and welcomed me. Because when I already have the source, why would I go back to the sign? So I tell, even in the book, when I mention it briefly, I'm like, my story is not prescriptive for people. It's descriptive of my own experience. And so do I Do I promote? Am I a massive proponent of psychedelics, and especially with the reemergence of all the research now? No. Do I say they're completely evil given my experience? No. You know, I have a bit of ambivalence because I'm like, is there research that can show how ketamine therapy, psilocybin, et cetera, can produce positive effects? Yes. Do I think most of the people who do psychedelics become leaders of justice, voices of compassion, these brilliant teachers? No, I think a lot of people like to get high, but that's not everybody. So I'm ambivalent towards where things are. I'm like, I get it, but also I have my critique. Of course, and this, so yeah.
Do you think you needed the psychedelics in order to get in touch with God?
Well, one, in an abstract general sense, no, I don't think people need that. I think that was my story. I can't really answer that for myself because that was my journey, you know? But even, for example, now I'm 37, so I was 18 when that happened. And in 20 years, I've never done psychedelics again and still have a continued practice of conscious experience of God. I've had even like profound, powerful, those kinds of more intense awakening moments with God, but also a sustained practice of silence and meditation that keeps grounding me in the presence of God. So I've continued that initial connection became a union of relationship and a union that's so close for that time. And there has been no further mushrooms or whatever involved in that process. Yeah.
Well, let's dive into your encounter. So you're on drugs, psychedelic drugs, and you have an encounter with a being you believe to be God. Explain how this went.
Oh man, these are like all the good questions right here. I love it, man. This is fun. And can you believe the listeners? It's only 6:52 a.m. right now in Hawaii. After we do this, we're gonna click off on this call. I'm just gonna sit back and just like, let me take a break really quick.
I'm gonna jump into another conversation as soon as we're done here. That's
okay. Yeah. Okay. On New Year's Eve, right? So this is my senior year of high school, right? Senior year, Christmas break, we're not in school, we're just doing our thing. My girlfriend at the time, who had moved to Hawaii, and we broke up, that's a whole different story, who's now my wife, by the way. She goes away, we're like seeing other people, she comes back at Christmas, and we're like, we still want this, we still really want this. And that was a powerful, profound experience, because I was in a darker place of questioning everything in my life, having an existential crisis, seeing beyond. I was supposed to play basketball in college, I was involved in music, like I had the life, and I was just like, if I'm honest with myself, I'm not happy though. I'm just restless, and I just can't go to sleep with being sober. I've been like that for a long time, and like, what is happening here? What is driving me? And when she came back, it was like a reigniting of the only form of light in my life, and it was powerful. New Year's Eve, me and her reconnected. Right before that, I go out, I eat a bunch of mushrooms. I'm tripping. We have a great night, and 2 nights later, I think to myself, I want to do more mushrooms because I loved them. And also it was the only place I ever felt at peace. It was the only time I felt like fully embodied. Like I remember sitting outside of my plug's house. That's somebody who you pick up drugs from to sell, right? So when I was young, and because I was slaying it when I was a kid. And so I was sitting outside my plug's house at 17. I still to this day remember sitting under this like bench or whatever. And I was like, I just want to be ... and just be at peace. Like I'm tired of needing the next high. I'm tired of needing more attention from people. That was my whole life. Like, is there a way to me, that cry of my heart was like, is there a way to ever just be at peace? And I didn't know. And mushrooms were the place where I felt that. They were always giving me a glimpse of the goal I hoped for. And so 2 nights after New Year's Eve, I'm like, I want to trip mushrooms again. I have a friend named Squirrel who will do anything at any time, probably. That's why I said in the book, I'm like, I took way more mushrooms than I ever did with my friend Squirrel, parentheses, I should have known it was going to go bad. And so we eat, back then we were microdosing. We were taking a lot. And so I eat on he's like, I don't want these. I said, I'm gonna eat those. I was more mushrooms than I ever did before, because I was like fearless at that point when it came to that. And usually at mushrooms, you peak at like an hour and a half. And I was like 45 minutes in, and I was just like, dude, I started for the first time having a really dark and scary trip that felt very overwhelming, and it felt like death was enveloped. It felt like darkness and death was like enveloping my entire being. And I remember just looking over at my friend Squirrel, and I like looked in his beady little eyes in that moment. I was like, hey, I don't feel right. And he looked at me, he was just like, me neither. And I was like, oh, he freaked me out. And I remember I was like, bro, I need to go to the hospital right now. I was like, I need to be in a straitjacket, like strapped to a bed. I don't care if I get arrested. I don't care if my parents find out. Like, I need to be under professional medical watch. Like, I'm not right. And something within me was like, call Christine. That was my girlfriend at the time, who I'm now married to. Call Christine. It's such a long story, but I go over to her house. When the house stopped like shaking, basically, and things calmed down, me and my friend Squirrel were over there. And so my wife, my girlfriend falls asleep, and my friend's just in his own zone. And I laid there on that bed and tell the story in the book. And for the next couple of hours, it was like I could feel light and love and life being infused into my entire being on an almost physical way. Like I laid there with this like what I would call this unguarded intimacy and openness that created room for spirit, for love, for grace, however I would have named it at the time, for the source to come in and just radically, it's like Neo plugged into the Matrix in the back of his head. Like I got up from that bed a few hours later, and I was like, I'm a different person. I was like, with the limited religious language I had, I thought to myself, that was a rebirth. And it was not just a rethinking of concepts. People can change their beliefs without changing. They just think differently. Oh, cool. You believe this now. Great. That doesn't mean you've been transformed into a more compassionate person. You could still be an asshole and be like, but I think this now. It's like, great. It wasn't just a rethinking of concepts. It was a rewiring of my actual consciousness. And one of the reasons why I say that was when I was going home and my parents came to pick me up. That's a whole different story. It was like 4 a.m. When I was in the back of the car, my parents are in the front, and of course, Squirrel's still with me in the back. And I remember thinking to myself, it's not that I'm having different thoughts about life, although I was. I said, it's not that I'm having different thoughts about life. It's the very I that is having those thoughts has been transformed.
A better person, would you say?
That it's a different person. It's a different sense of self. It wasn't just, you can have new beliefs and be the same person, but it's like, no, the very I that is doing the thinking, that is doing the emotions, that is doing the believing, that sense of I, whatever that is, has been completely transformed. And so that experience, like, and that moment, I would tell people, like, without that was, that experience was the warmth of a mother, the embrace of a father, the friendship of a sibling. It was always
warm, fuzzy feelings.
It was all those things of like, oh, everything I've hustled and worked for up until this point was just offered to me freely at the lowest moment in my life. And this is everything. This somehow changes everything. And I gave my life to keep pursuing that.
Interesting. So thank you for telling me that story. Also available in book form.
Yes, sir.
So you had this experience. Oh, I apologize. I accidentally started my other computer here.
Yo, I have another podcast interview going on here.
I was editing the show earlier on this side. So this warm, fuzzy feeling you got. You were on drugs. You were back with the person that you love.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things combined right there is going to give you some warm, fuzzy feelings. You're laying there. You're next to this person you've reunited with. That just apologies. This is just what I'm seeing out of this right now.
No, absolutely, of course.
And all of that experience gave you that warm, fuzzy feeling. I'm home. I get the same feeling when I'm with my wife too. It's that warm, fuzzy. This is where I belong. She's the person that I love the most important person in my life. Blah 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 blah. That's the same thing that thinking is going on with you. You never actually. The problem I see is you never actually encountered God. You just had a feeling, and you attributed that feeling while you were on drugs to God. Now, have you actually physically seen or interacted with this God, this Yahweh?
Well, to the last question, have I like physically interacted in some like quantifiable, empirically verifiable sense? Of course not. That's to me where
Why? Of
these are
course not.
different. Well, because to me, these are like spirit, love, compassion, empathy. These are not
Emotions.
quantifiable in the same. Say it again.
Emotions. Yeah, physical
Yeah,
feelings and stuff like that. But God's not an emotion; He's an actual physical being, correct?
Physical being? No, I think to
No.
me, God is primarily like the deepest dimension of life itself. God is spirit. I mean, if for somebody who's a Christian would say God came in the form of, Christ in an incarnated way at a particular moment in history.
Huh.
But those are good. The questions, like, even when that happened to me, right? So how do I make the leap from that experience to one attributing it to God and also eventually to being a Christian? Because that's a whole nother leap conceptually, right?
Not just a God, your specific God. Yeah.
Right. And I do remember right after that happened, when I was still in high school, thinking to myself, if I had this same sort of existential journey of questioning, seeing through my illusions, just seeing through everything I'm doing is bullshit. It doesn't, all I want is approval because I think that's validation. It's not all that stuff, right? You could have that in any context. And I said, well, if I did that in a, let's say I'm in Jordan and my friend who, his family's from there, I'm thinking who I grew up with. But if I was in a different context where, let's say, Islam is the predominant religion, culture, ethical, etc., kind of like worldview, would I not then, if I had the same encounter with spirit, would I not then attribute it and just say, well, it must have been Allah and this is the story? And at that point, I'm
Buddha,
like, maybe
Allah,
I don't know what to say about that, But when it came to the experience, like, to me, God, spirit, is not only a religious experience, it is that which transforms your experience itself. So it is an experience, but it's also that which transforms everything else. It transforms how you experiences itself.
Do you think love can do that too?
Absolutely. But to me, love is the substance of God. So for me, even like from my girlfriend at the time and then direct, immediate, the same love that flows through my girlfriend towards me or my wife now is the same love that is the love of God. It's just mediated through a incarnational sort of, bodily way, but it's the same substance from my perspective. So,
well, hold on. Let me clarify that a little bit. So is it God sending the love through your girlfriend, or is it the same love your girlfriend has is similar to the same love, or wife, the same love that Yahweh has? Is that
to me, the substance of love is universal. It's the same thing. It can come in more when you have a direct encounter with God, which I believe is possible. And actually, that's the defining mark of a mystic. If someone asks what a mystic is defined by direct experience of the sacred, direct, unmediated experience of spirit, that oftentimes defies the cultural expectations or conventions of religions. Well, the same, I thought about it like this, and I had this profound experience at 24 in front of my fire, just in a time of silence, where if I think about spirit, love, God, grace, universal acceptance, a universal affirmation of your life, for me, those are all the same thing. Think about it like a mist that's flowing towards all of us at any moment, right? It's just the infinite love of God is pouring itself out to all people at all times in the exact same way, regardless of tradition, sexuality, it doesn't matter. It's all there.
Interesting.
Well,
regardless of all that.
Absolutely. Okay. And so to me, the whole spiritual journey is about waking up towards that which is. It's about learning to see. It's about learning to experience. It's about removing everything in our lives that's getting in the way of us being present to, aware of, and experiencing God, love, grace. Okay, that's great. But usually for people, that's such a challenging thing to do, to tune into that frequency so often. So that's the beauty of the incarnation in Christ. It's not just God saying, oh, well, love God is fully present in this person of Jesus. That is an indicator that love God is fully present through earth, flesh and blood, relationships, people, experiences, the trees, all these things are all incarnating and fully expressing the presence and love of God at any moment. So
how do you know that, and why do you believe that? I mean, everything, all this love and everything is coming from your God specifically. Why do you believe that?
Well, to me, God is one. So it's coming from, if there is a source, if there is some sort of creator of all of this, that is, that the deepest structure is love, and that's for everybody, right? To me, it's not my God, it's just God, and that's for everybody, regardless of tradition.
Well, I mean, there's thousands of gods out there what we can choose from, but yes, you're a specific God. So why do you believe he's love, though? Like, I think that's the confusing part for me here.
Well, when you said, how do you know, I'll answer that question. I'll tell you a funny story. In my intro to the book, I told the story of, I'm in my early 20s. I'm walking around. I lived in Orange County at the time, and I'm walking around, contemplative walk, silence, solitude, no specific aim, just to be present to life, to God, to myself. And in that moment, I had this funny interaction. I can't remember if I just thought it or said it out loud, but the interaction went, it's one of those moments where you just know. And another voice says, know what?
Yeah.
and then the first voice says, I don't know, but you just do.
Oh, okay.
And that's why if someone were to say, do you know God? Do you know Spirit? I would say yes. And someone would say, how do you know? Do you know for sure? And I would say no. How do you know? I would say no, because one of those is a relational, deep, mysterious, connective kind of knowing. The other one is a cognitive, based on certainty. Do I know with certainty that Jesus is this? No, of course not. Do I know with certainty in a cognitive way that God is love? Of course not. So when you ask, one, I have that built into all of this, is that mystery and what people call an epistemic humility, epistemology. How do we know? It's a humility that says, I know this, I sense this, I'm trusting this, I'm falling into this, but do I know with certainty? Does anyone have privileged access to the secret of what is? No, I don't believe that, But when you ask the question, like, why do I believe, or how do I know it's love? I'm like, that's a part of the mystery of how someone would ask you how you love your wife. I'm like,
different.
There's something that happens in that space of openness to love and to give and receive love that is not irrational. It's transrational. To me, it transcends the rational mind, and it requires more than that.
Actions. I know my wife loves me by her actions. Same as me. She knows I love her by my actions. If I was a complete dick the entire time, she wouldn't think I love her. I mean, it's just obvious. So when I see things from Yahweh, Jesus, or your God specifically, I don't see the loving part. I've read the Bible. I've read his autobiography about himself and his stories and his actions throughout history. If that's true, then the God you're advocating for is a documented child killer. And at that point, I don't see that as love. I mean, we can both, you think that the flood happened, right? I mean, that every baby on the planet drowned to death because he was upset because he made people. He regret making people. That's what it says in the book there. So, I mean, the loving part, I struggle to see it. I hear it a lot, but I fail to see where that idea and that concept comes from, besides the whole verse in John that says God is love. But when you read his actions, it just doesn't add up. It's like I tell my kids, make your actions match your words. If you're saying you're loving, let's see those loving actions. That's where I'm at. So where does that concept come for you?
Yeah, one, that's a great point. And what's fascinating and tragic as well is those same arguments or the same evidence you would use in the scriptures to make that claim. You can look around us today at people who bear the name of Jesus and still make that claim. You know what I'm saying? Like, you look around at Christians today, you can look at the church in our culture in the United States of America and still be like, I still don't see the love. It's been thousands of years, right? And I'm with you on that. And I have my own critiques and I have my own issues and struggles with that, and like I said, that prophetic voice, I have my own version of calling that out and hopefully calling something to more beautiful. To the question, the scriptures are this long story of, 66 different books that were written over thousands of years. Right. And, if I tell my kids are 3 and 5, if I'm reading them a story of Noah or these early stories, It's like, hey, this story happened.
Mm.
As we get older and we develop more critical lenses and get educated, like, well, actually, there's different genres of literature. This is poetry. This is how they told stories back then. It wasn't Genesis 1 is not a science book, right? You know, like
I know.
now some scholars would say Genesis 1 through 11 is what you call prehistory, right? So it's not. Do I read that story as literal, a flood on the planet? No. You know, do I think Jonah was literally inside the belly of a fish, or we read it as whale, even though it says large fish? Probably not. You can believe that story if you want to. Like when I preach that in the church, I'm like, some people believe that, some don't. The point of this story is that God's actually calling Jonah to show love and compassion, or to preach towards his enemies. The real point of the story is, can you love people you've been conditioned to hate? And sometimes we can argue about the details of a story and avoid the actions you're describing, the loving actions that it's actually calling us to. So what I see in the scriptures are massive stages and steps forward in human consciousness. So when I look at 1,000 years ago, I'm like, the scriptures reflect the violent, barbaric hunter-gatherer thing at the time. And to me, there's a beauty in seeing the life of the spirit in the world as this gravitational pull from the future, pulling us forward in history. And that thing ultimately climaxes, crescendos in the person of Jesus. That to me is where all of that moves towards in the love is, of course there was violence, because that's how the culture worked back then. Of course there was that. So God does not completely try to transform everything at once. He's calling humanity forward one single step at a time. So even books like Leviticus, where you're like, this is insane. Like, what is happening? This is, but
it's quite a few of those books, but yeah.
If you look at some of the rituals they're giving people, it's like, hey, well, if you go through this ritual process, you can be seen as clean by the community, be welcome back. Yeah. That at that moment in history was a radical, progressive step forward for them. Oh, you mean I can do these rituals and have confidence I'm right with God and the people? Some people had never heard of that. So that to us is insanity. Absolutely. But to them, that was seen as a radical step forward. That was a huge moment of progress. So the scriptures to me are showing steps forward in human consciousness. Yeah.
Honestly, I think the sacrificial system that Yahweh required, the bloodshed of innocent life in order to forgive people, forgive people for what they've done to piss him off, I think is ridiculous. I think a radical, absolutely. I think a radical thing would have been, hey, you don't have to kill anything to me. I'm different from these other gods. You don't need to slaughter innocent life. I can forgive you in another way. But that's not what we see. We see God still requiring bloodshed. Throughout the whole Bible, he requires bloodshed. And even in the end, he requires the bloodshed of his own son himself in order to forgive people. So again, we still have death.
Depending on how we read that story.
Oh no.
You know?
What do you mean?
Because all of those rituals, like if you look at those, the whole, sacrificial system, right, in the Old Testament, that's one example of a lot of things we can look at. Violence, it's like there's commands of, people don't want to admit this, but there's commands the scriptures record that apparently come directly from God to slaughter entire villages, which would include women and children.
Absolutely. It says specifically kill kids in there. And God himself in several stories actually comes down and physically kills children. So the way I read that and the way I think about the Bible is, well, did God actually command people to do that? Or does that command from God reflect the current cultural, historical understanding that people had of God at the moment? Well, of course, it's like people, today, it's like even with like a lot of Christians, like, well, God told me to do this. Yeah.
I'm like, okay. Or is that your own egoic impulses? Is that your own, et cetera, what your desire? And now, of course, there's a convenient screen to project it on. Well, God wanted me to break up with you, so now I don't have to feel like a dick or whatever.
Yeah.
And
what about Abraham and Isaac? Do you think that story happened?
Well, to me, that would be, I feel like those Leviticus stories of what seems regressive to us actually could have been massive steps forward for human beings at that time.
I think when you're
in it, I
don't keep slaves, don't rape women. I mean, these are very easy things. don't stone disobedient children to death, don't kill innocent lives. I mean, these are very easy things that would have been very radical at the time, but Yahweh chose, don't worship any other gods before me or I'll kill you or your kids. You know, these are the things he chose instead of don't rape, don't have slaves,
me,
you know, all those simple things would have made it a lot better.
Even stories like at Abraham, for example, you could read as other gods, Baal, all these gods around you that you're familiar with do require deaths of children. And this story is a way of saying that I'm not like that. Well, because for
why
me,
wouldn't he just say that instead of having Abraham slaughter his kid almost, well, know?
To me, those are abstract questions. Those are hypothetical abstract questions that I don't really ask, to be honest. Even now for people, those stories are so similar to ours, where let's say people come to a critical moment in their life and they're like, man, for people who believe in God, why won't God just tell me what to do? Just tell me, hey, go to UCLA instead of USC because kids are stressed out over where they're going.
Some people think he does, you know.
And some people think that, but instead, I think the way God's spirit love works is an invitation. It's a calling into wisdom. I think you can have a direct personal experience, but the same audio, why doesn't God just do this? Like back then, it's a story of human beings slowly responding. So for me, because I read that so differently, of not like God saying this, God doing that. It's people growing. It's people responding to the invitations and then recording their understanding of it based on how they see it the moment. So I'll look like, even pastorally, the growth of one person right now in their life looks very different from the next step of growth for another person, because their historical background, they have different trauma, they have different experiences at different ages. So I remember years ago, there was this friend of my wife's and mine, and, you know, however she looked to us as a pastor and a guy, we didn't even start the church yet. But I remember her telling us once, like, I was at the beach and this girl was like talking shit basically, and I didn't punch her. And to me, I'm like, that's a sign of growth.
Oh, yeah.
Now for her and her, that is a real step of growth for her in her life. Now, 10 years later, hopefully the strong urge to punch somebody on the beach you have an issue with, hopefully that urge will be minimized to the point where we're not celebrating in growth. Now you didn't punch somebody. Maybe you showed them compassion. Maybe you actually helped them. Maybe you somehow became friends with them. But that's 10 years later on the stage of that, on the journey of evolution. So to me, we celebrate that mark 10 years here. 10 years later, it looks like a different thing. I see that same movement in the scriptures as a whole of the Old Testament. Hey, it's cool you said don't rape people after you pillage them. That's better, I think. Why didn't you just stop it all at once? I'm like, because that's one, to me, that's not how human beings actually evolve and grow. It's one step at a time. And to me, I don't see as a direct supreme being telling people to do that. It's people growing and then reflecting on their understanding of that along the way.
So I think would have been better if he sent everybody that happy feeling that you got, and they changed their lives. And then the whole thing of, hey, stop raping, stop owning slaves, don't stone disobedient children to death. I mean, I think that would have been great. Don't you think? Instead of flooding the whole earth, stuff like that.
And I think that would have been great. And also to this day right now, I look at a lot of people and what I've been through in my life, what other people have been through, the pain, the suffering in a personal sense, in interpersonal relationships, in geopolitical national conflicts and all the things we see. And I wish it didn't have to be that hard for people. I wish people didn't have to suffer as much as they did. I wish domestic abuse wasn't as prevalent as it is. I wish families didn't have to have their whole families turned upside down because of addiction. I wish the wars, I wish all these things didn't have to happen. And for me, the abstract questions of like, why, I just don't think about. I'm like, I'm not an idealist. In the same way, I can see the spirit working through these Old Testament texts, or when you can look at Buddhists from the past, where it's like, here's these enlightened people who are extremely ethnocentric and racist because they're a product of their time, you know, or in any culture. I'm like, I'm okay with human beings slowly evolving and growing, even though I know it sucks, even though I would love if my friends didn't have to suffer the way they did and I didn't have to suffer the way I did sometimes. I would love it if it was more simple, but it's not. But this is the world we have, and I love it, and I embrace it, and I commit my own humble version of that slow growth in my life and the people around me where I am.
Slow growth. Well, do you think you went through a slow growth?
Absolutely. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, you can look at the journey of the scriptures and the Bible as a metaphor for what every human being goes through in our own evolution.
So when you had, but when you had your psychedelic moment with the drug thing, when you had that moment of feeling, that was a fast moment. It all happened at once, right? It wasn't a slow thing.
That was one of those, you will have moments in your life, even if people know about developmental theories and stages of consciousness, there's a entering into a new stage of being solidified in it and an exiting and then a breaking through to another one. And you will it's like when an artist like really pops, like a musician, it's like, holy they're an overnight success. I'm like, no, they've been doing tours for 7 years you never cared about.
Also
they did a show for 15 people that if you saw would have been embarrassing. They were in their room writing, etc. Right. And all of a sudden it's like it tipped overnight. I'm like, not for them.
Not for them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that moment for me, for example, why was that moment when I look back so transformative in an immediate sense? And I can look at that and say, I already started to let go of the illusions that were driving me. That creates space within me. I already started to deal with some of the interior wounds and issues I had that creates space and a fertile ground within you. So I had done a lot of things that created this openness to be able to receive that, right? That's why the great Rumi says your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it.
What about the people it doesn't work for though? Like what about the people that don't have that openness? They go through their whole life and Yahweh never opens them up to this experience.
Well, even that statement right there, Yahweh never opens them up. God's job is not to open your heart. That's our job.
Interesting. So what happens if we open our heart and God doesn't show?
That's a complex question that I think is very moment to moment. I would talk to people in their life, because from my understanding and what I've seen, the way love, grace, acceptance works, whether you call it God or not, you don't have to name it as God, right? But when somebody is, for example, whenever someone truly forgives, I believe it creates more spaciousness in your life. It takes a burden off you, it takes a weight off of you. To me, that is how things work. Do I know with certainty about that? Like I know about God? Of course not. But that's what I sense. That's what I've experienced. That's what I've seen. That's what the wisdom traditions historically have showed us.
Well, a little bit opposite though has actually happened to me. I grew up in the church. I consider myself Jesus freak. All, Jesus. I never met the guy. I never had an experience with the guy. I had little happy, warm, fuzzy feelings like you've
like going to a concert or something.
Exactly. Like watching the end of your favorite movie, it's like, you're just there. And it's like everything in you is just electric and it's awesome. But that doesn't mean that it's an invisible man somewhere sending you these things. And I go to the Bible tells me in 2 Chronicles 14:9, if you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. One of my least favorite verses here. It's just so horrible towards people who have been trying and God isn't presenting himself to you. And then we get blamed for it. We get forsaken because we can't see that evidence. We don't feel him, see him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of blaming the victim here at this point. Yahweh says, if I seek him, I'll be found by him. I will find him. It did not happen. My heart was poured out. My knees were bowed, or my head was bowed. My knees were, you know what I mean? And nothing. The Bible tells me I should have been able to find him. Years, never showed up. But now what I do is I forsake this character called Yahweh, because in the Bible, he's a horrible, horrible monster, jealous, punishing children. Now he's going to forsake me, all because he never showed up for me. So that openness doesn't work for everybody. Why do you think that is? And do I deserve the hellfire that comes from non-belief?
Do I deserve hellfire because of non-belief? Of course not.
Well, that's what the Bible tells us, though. Is that not true?
Well, again, it's like in the Second Chronicles, when we're looking back thousands of years at people's understanding of God at that point.
Interesting.
So to me,
so this isn't true. Sorry, I just want to jump to this right here. So
No,
that
please.
Bible verse isn't relevant, is what you're saying.
I'm not saying it's not relevant. I'm saying it's very relevant. And at the same time, it's reflective of the way people understood their standing with God at the time. People also thought there was like a 3-tier. I mean, the Apostle Paul, this profound, right, early revolutionary in the church, he believed in a 3-tier understanding of the universe: earth, heaven, hell below. They didn't know we were on a planet, rotating around. So in the same way, their their astronomical understanding of the universe and their social understanding of things and the value of women at the time and having slaves, like also their understanding of God was reflective of we're at the stage of where they were a long time ago. So a verse like that is relevant, but it also reflects their current understanding of God. Oh, if I forsake God, daddy, sky god, daddy, Triton, whoever up in the sky, this version we have, is mad at me and will forever close himself off to me. I think that's an understanding of God people have at early stages of their faith. God's mad at me when I do something bad.
Yeah.
Does that necessarily mean, if there is some sort of source of all of this, creative source, spirit, God, does that mean then that is how God works? Actually, in reality, that if I forsake him, whatever that means, he's mad at me forever? No. To me, that means at that point, that's how they understood things. And I think human beings have evolved enough to see things differently than that.
So we've got
the openness part, that's a big thing, because openness, I've known when you preaching is a humbling thing, and it can be a very humiliating thing to the ego, because you're like, I just gave you the juice and that person was sleeping. I just told you how your life could be revolutionized and that person's checked out. That's a mystery of human consciousness. Is why do some people wake up, transform, and change? Why do people I love be stuck in addiction forever? Why do I have friends who are in and out of jail, for example? And there's a unique thing about openness and relationality and connection, and why some people wake up. And I still believe openness is one of those things, again, that you can't quantify in an empirical sense. It's sometimes people could say, well, I'm just as open, and they're in church and they're grunting and they're God, Jesus, and they're crying and all that. But then when you speak to them, they're still not ready to go there with the truth of their life. They still don't want to be honest about the wounds in their past, that have the trauma, which I understand. There's no judgment there. It's hard to go back and do that real work. So they're open, but then I could go to other parts of them and say, but are you really open for this? To me,
I totally was open. I was totally open.
then,
I poured everything out to this guy, 100%. No, I mean, if this was, either I did this, I connected with God, or what I was taught was I was going to burn forever in hell. My skin was going to burn off, and the next day it'd grow back just so the devil can burn it off again. This is what I was told. So yes, everything in me was trying to connect with this savior of mine. But what I really want to question, though, you're telling me that a lot of the Bible stuff is people trying to understand God 2,000 years ago. So which part of this, people trying to understand God, where they got it wrong, this isn't accurate. I mean, if we seek him, he's not going to forsake us, right? You don't believe that. So the same thing with the flood. So which parts of this can we trust, and why?
Well, for me with that, you trust the whole thing, but not in a literal sense of, oh, it says this, we do this. That one said, don't ride donkeys after noon. Okay, so we don't do like those types of things.
Well, it says to pray and you pray. You says to believe and you believe. So you do believe and follow some of it.
Oh,
Why
absolutely.
do you believe and follow some
of
of it, but not all of it?
How
and,
I
and
see
how
that,
do you know? Sorry. And how do you
that
know
story
decipher between the two?
Yeah, the hermeneutics, for people listening in, it's not an exciting word, hermeneutics, interpretation.
Oh, it's very exciting. I love hermeneutics.
It's the science and art of, interpreting. We can talk about interpreting the Bible. We can talk about interpreting sacred texts. We can talk about Paul Ricoeur and people like that, hermeneutics is actually just life itself is a text. Everything's interpretation, right? You can never escape that. We're all interpreting. There's no uninterpreted experiences or phenomena in life. There's a humility to that, because who the hell knows on one level, right?
Who knows?
No one has.
That's why I choose not to just go for the things I don't know. That's another thing too, is I choose not to believe in things I don't fully understand.
And no one has privileged access to the secret, as John Caputo, a radical philosopher, said before. And for me, I see an arc to that story that crescendos and leads to this person of Jesus.
So you like the idea of Jesus?
Absolutely. I've given my whole life to this. How do you know the
Jesus stories are accurate? If it's not just some people 2,000 years ago lifting up their guru. They had this guru, he died. All of a sudden, after he's dead, well, guess what? He performed miracles. Also, he's the savior of the universe. He had to die because God needed blood in order to forgive people. And if he didn't die, we'd all be going blah, 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 blah. That's how I see it. It doesn't make much sense to really take it any other way. We have nothing to go off of. And you're telling me that the majority of this book is just the idea of people coming up with ideas of God, what they thought it was.
But even coming up with those ideas doesn't mean there's no such thing as God as their spirit. It just means, like we said, hermeneutics, everything's interpretation, right? Even the New Testament, people are interpreting and reflecting on their experiences and writing about it years later, whatever. And so for me, the path of Jesus is, if I see it not as primarily as a belief system, I believe all these orthodox things about Jesus. He's the Son of God. He's this or that. These are the metaphysical beliefs you're supposed to have as a Christian. But if my primary orientation is a path, then I say, man, compassion does lead to the fullness of life. Forgiving your enemies and not living with resentment, that does lead to a further experience of life.
Those are just a few things that Jesus has said. Yes, Jesus said nice things, just like the Buddha, which is where he got a lot of his stuff from, was from the Buddhists or the Hindus. So when we look at the story of Jesus, do you believe every story about Jesus in the Bible, or is it just some of them? Because there's a lot in here. Jesus tells us that he does not come to bring peace in Matthew 10. He comes to bring a sword and division, to separate families. He says, if you don't hate your brother and mother and father, and then you can't follow him. You have to hate people. And then there's the time that Jesus got angry or hangry. Sorry, he didn't have breakfast. So he curses a fig tree who's out of fruit, which he knew ahead of time that it was already, because he knows everything. And then he curses it. Instead of making it grow and feeding the whole village, he curses it so it dies. I don't see all of those things as good. So do you take those stories out of it and just keep the love your neighbor stuff, or how does that work for you? Is it the whole Jesus or just some of the Jesus?
For me, it's I take the whole flesh and blood, earthy, real Jesus.
Gotcha.
That is there, and the path that he invites us into. And even within those three examples and stories, when we talk about hermeneutics, there's so many assumptions about that you have when you say, God does this, or Jesus said this, and this is how that story worked, and that's the art of interpretation, is doing that. So there's complex things about each one of those stories, the whole causing division in families. Okay, well, is that a Jesus saying, I want there to be division? Or is that somehow a way to get at the fact that when you transcend family systems, when you grow and evolve, it's going to create division in your family. It's going to create division amongst friends. That's
the whole thing of Christianity. So we can all join families and whatnot in heaven. Why wouldn't he go with that?
Dealing with the reality, it shouldn't. Hey, in an ideal world, you're right. In an ideal world, your growth should not offend people, but it does. Because if you grow up in an unhealthy family system, for example, I'll give you an example. Let's say you grow up in an unhealthy family system that has very toxic forms of communication, very withholding or dominating, or people grow up in different versions, and your family's ethnocentric. Let's say they're white supremacist. Let's say they're racist. Let's say they're anti-immigration. Let's say they're anti all these things. And you start to grow and you say, hey, I actually believe we live in a world where everybody has equal value, and that starts to be reflected in my politics. And you change the way you see things socially, and you're learning to love people. Your family's conditioned you to hate. that will cause division in your family.
That
Not
will cause
because you
division.
want it,
But that's
not because you want it, because your growth will offend people. You're saying, guys, it gets bigger than this. It gets more beautiful. Humanity's more interesting. It all gets better than this. Come along. And they're like, our son has gone off of the path. Our son has betrayed us. Your growth will offend people who want to stay in that same framework. So when I hear, that's just one example. When I hear a story like that, I'm like, that's how things work.
That's
it
one
sucks
way
that it's like
to
that.
interpret the hermeneutics of it, of course. But
Totally.
when you dive down into these other specific, Jesus wants his disciples to hate their family. If that's Luke 14:26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Why would Jesus, specifically Jesus, the happiest little guru on the planet, why would he want you to hate anybody? First off, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And let alone your own family, your wife, your kids. Why would Jesus want you to hate your wife and kids?
See, again, that it would be stories like that would reflect the reality of changing growth and how that affects relationships. I don't read that and say, oh, that as people are writing this down, right, 30, 40, 50 years later, recording these things, that to me, I don't take as they necessarily have to be 100% accurate in the way we as Westerner post-Enlightenment understand history and science and that. These are storytellers. They make a point, like my wife's one of the best storytellers on the planet. And every time my wife tells a story, the details are different. but the engine of it, she wants to tell people this meal we had was amazing. That's the point she's getting at. So for me, when I look at ancient storytelling, there is this engine that's driving it. And I guess the way I read things, sometimes I'm like, if there is a loving source, it would make no sense for that same loving source who said, forgive your enemy, to also say, hate your wife. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I'm like, okay, there's this, there's exegesis, reading from the text, eisegesis, we read into the text, right? For people who care about that type of stuff. And so eventually as a part of the hermeneutic of love, a hermeneutic of justice and compassion, as we read into it, is to say, I'm seeing unconditional love and forward thinking movement in everything I do. So when I see it, I say, oh, there's something real here. But the way people have written it, the way it's been recorded, the details of it could throw us off. What Jesus wants to cause division? No, that shows us what happens. Oh, hate? No, it means there is this source that is before. This isn't just an example. There's a source things that gives life to all things, and our life in a sacred cosmos is oriented correctly when that is the foundation of everything. And then everything, there's ways to read that for me that are helpful and loving and that create the loving actions, like you said earlier, in this world. What is extrapolating a Christ-like, loving, compassion-oriented, justice-seeking way of being in the world? And for me, the details, and I have the degrees, I've done those things, I get it. But where I'm at now, and even when you talk about the life of a mystic, I'm like, how is this text leading us to transformation? How is it helping me love how is it helping me be more present to my kids? How is it helping me? Like, what is it doing in the world? That's what I'm more interested in.
So what I see, now, again, I mean, no offense at all, but what I see is you've taken the God and the demigod that have been described in this book, and you've separated them from the stories that are in there about them. No, God didn't do this. No, Jesus doesn't want you to hate people. You have to change it to be
not what I said, but keep going.
That you have, this particular God. Sorry if I'm strawmanning, but the particular God that you have created that is love. Your God is love no matter what is in that book. Your God is love. No matter what this tells you. You have this idea of a loving God. So no matter what's in there, Jesus telling you to hate Jesus in Mark 16, telling you, go ahead and drink poison, it's going to be great. Or Yahweh in the Old Testament telling you to stone homosexuals to death. All those things don't attribute to your God. So therefore, all that stuff you just push aside and you read the happy Jesus parts. That's what I'm doing.
Definitely not what I said. Because what's fascinating is my experience of having that initial encounter, like I said, when I was 18 and years later or whenever, or soon after, starting to identify that which I experienced with the person of Jesus, those stories, those experiences, those things that have been recorded about Jesus have given me more confidence that yes, in fact, God is love, because you're mentioning a few, you know, of course the Bible is weird. You're mentioning a few strange things, and yes, let's do some interpretation. Let's do some stuff around all those things. But
it's a lot from beginning to end, man. I'm just tidbits here, but go ahead.
No, yeah. The Old Testament, like I said, you're seeing human beings growing, reflecting on that. It's all strange. It all looks weird. Just like when I tell you a girl who's 20 years old is celebrating the fact she didn't punch somebody in the face. That sounds like, how could that be growth? That is growth for her, though, because we're looking at it's a historical trajectory. But when it crescendos, when Jesus has these statements like you've heard it said, but I said, that is a massive, just like when you look at my own experience at 18, where that wasn't slow growth, that was a radical sort of revolutionizing moment. And I think Christ in Jesus was this breaking, radical, revolutionizing moment. And why would one of the greatest peace activists that we know of the past 150 years, Gandhi, as a Hindu, wake up and for 10 years straight read the Sermon on the Mount every morning, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, because he said it was the greatest teaching on peace that in nonviolence he's ever seen. So
it's such a sliver, though. That is such a sliver of the things that are in this book.
And perhaps that's where, and again, in our interpretation, and I'm seeing with continuity, I'm also seeing a radical transformation from the Old Testament to the New, because the person of Jesus creates this radical like breakthrough moment. So that is probably where you and I see things differently. Is I see this arc, this unfolding, growing, evolving arc towards, how do you go from, hey, don't kill as many people or something, like just tell them the whole thing in the Old Testament, right? Just why don't you say more than that?
Yeah.
To me, you go from this like, hey, after you kill all of them, don't do these couple things, or protect the women, or take the women after you've taken a village, take the women as your wives instead of killing them, which to us is insane.
Yeah. Could you imagine being a woman? This man just slaughtered your whole family. Now you're going to be forced to marry him, and his God
reflective of the barbarism and violence of the time, which is not just true for the Bible, it's true globally or in different cultures of how violence worked and how patriarchy, etc. But to me, you go from that into this evolving, changing into how does one of the greatest peace activists who's not a Christian look at these teachings of Jesus as the most radical teachings of nonviolence ever. So I see an evolving movement. So it's like, well, of course it was crazy back then, but where it moves to, for me, I have not seen in terms of where it's going.
Where is it going?
Even a vision that eventually leads to justice, peace, new heavens, new earth. The whole thing is moving towards unity and oneness, and that Jesus is pointing us to. So whereas you see the majority of it is negative, I see an evolving trajectory towards the most radical, beautiful, hopeful vision of love, justice, and peace that I've seen, which is one of the reasons why I'm still a Christian.
So where is it going, Kevin, though? Where is it going? Where's all this love from this little sliver part of the Bible? Where is it headed? Like, what's the end result? Because what I see in Revelation is pretty violent. Jesus is going to like destroy a lot of people. He's going to set them on fire. He's going to
interpretations.
So what's going to happen?
There are other, besides the whole 1970s Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, Revelation, literal. Have you ever seen the Seth Rogen movie, like This Is the End?
No.
You ever seen that?
Yeah. Well, you got that movie.
It's about the rapture. It's hilarious. It's ridiculous. It's one of my favorite like Seth Rogen movies.
It is really.
But that goes to show how popular that understanding of rapture is. It's in the pop cultural consciousness enough where they made a movie about it. And it's hilarious.
Yeah. So, what do you think is going to happen? How is it going to?
Well, for me, all of that is a complete misreading of Revelation. So first of all, I don't believe in the rapture, and a lot of Christians don't, by the way. The rapture is a very new phenomenon that is not a historical belief in Christianity. That's a very that's a very early 20th century. A guy from Scotland came here and started preaching it, and fundamentalist evangelicals were like, yes, this is everything, when I think it's ridiculous and dangerous and toxic, etc. Revelation going towards 21, this vision of a new heaven and a new earth, Revelation 21, 1-5, which to me, Revelation it's called, the genre is apocalypse. So it's like poetry and it's imagery. It's all this crazy shit. But what you see is this image in Revelation 21 where there are no more tears, where there's justice, where there's a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem.
There's
So
no more
for
night.
me,
There's no more night, and we all have to worship Yahweh forever. Not my idea of
there
a peaceful,
is
awesome
this
place.
beautiful poetic movement
Of what these people
towards
thought heaven would be like. To them, streets of gold would be awesome. They thought that was
yeah, well,
great.
that's all.
No more
That's all
night.
imagery and
it's sun all the
metaphors.
time.
Totally.
Right.
That's
The whole
all
thing is a metaphor. I don't see it as being actual first possible when the stars
But
fall
that's
to the
the
earth. I think
the
that's hilarious.
power. The power of poetry and imagination is to give us symbols and ways of thinking about the possibility of what could be. So when I read that the way it is in Revelation 21, 1-5, where it's crescendoing towards the tree of life, to me, what do I come away from that? And I say, somehow everything's going to be okay. Frederick Buechner says the resurrection means the worst thing is never the last thing. And so that is a part of that story for me. When I look at the cosmic arc, if there is a cosmic trajectory, if there actually is a flow to this universe, if there is a telos point that it's moving towards, do I know exactly how that works out? Of course not. Nobody knows. No one knows what's on the other side. But in this story that I find myself in, this beautiful, amazing story that, for you is a small sliver, for me is a trajectory. I'm like, oh, this is showing us somehow in this mysterious way it moves towards justice and unity and oneness. And I want to be a part of helping create the beginning stages of that possibility right now.
Well, we are out of time here. We're about to roll into my next conversation. I do have to go. I would love to continue this conversation. I do want to talk more. You're a lot of fun. I appreciate your time today, Kevin. Go ahead. I'll give you the last word. And then after that last word, tell us where we can find all your stuff.
Yes, the last word. First of all, so much fun. I have another book coming out in January. I'm hitting you up again.
Do it.
That book is all about letting go. It's called The Joy of Letting Go.
Nice.
So last word for you meant, again, thank you so much for having me on. I didn't know exactly what I was getting in for. I knew it would be interesting, and it was, and I enjoyed this time. It was a lot of fun.
Same.
And for people listening in, here's my unusual and uncommon pastoral last word for people. I have this deep sense that there's always more life ahead. That there can be more joy, regardless of whether you believe what I believe right now about Jesus, right? On one level, I don't even care because of the common humanity we share. I believe there can always be more joy, more life, more courage, more bravery, more connection. And I think through our own letting go, forgiveness, courage, etc., we can help be the agents that create the openness towards that path. And I have hope for everybody to continue to grow and evolve and experience more life. That's what I want for people.
Yeah.
And then after that, podcast, The Church Needs Therapy, my new book, The Making of a Mystic, My Journey with Mushrooms, My Life as a Pastor, and Why It's Okay for Everyone to Relax, is out May 31st on Choir Publishing. You can get it on Amazon since people aren't here. And I hopefully will be back again. And for those who have listened in, thank you. And yeah, man, so much fun, dude. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, man. Yeah, always strive to be a better human being. We all share this planet together. Let's make it better. Love it, man.
Yes,
Thank you so
sir.
much for coming on.
Yep.
Take care. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, man.
And that's all the show there is for you today. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard and want to help keep the recording light on, simply go to patreon.com/BSW the podcast and sign up to be a supporter of the show. Your episodic tithes of $1 or more will give you access to the patron feed, unaired conversations, early access to each episode, and much more. For the latest events, BSW swag, and a peek behind the scenes, head on over to the show's ever-evolving webpage at thebiblesayswhat.com. The Bible Says What the book is out. Head on over to thebiblesayswhat.com and get yourself and your grandma a signed copy. Thanks to the cosmic powers of the internet, it is now possible to buy me a beer or coffee online. Simply go to buymeacoffee.com/BSW the podcast and click the appropriate buttons. If you can't support the show monetarily, please like, share, and or leave a review. As always, you can find me at the Bible Says What Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or Instagram pages. You can also reach me at bswthepodcast@gmail.com. And no matter which platform you use to listen to your podcasts, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on the next episode. Until then, would you kindly pick up your Bibles and read them?
Don't ignore them. I
Okay,
don't
so
think
1
they're
Timothy
consistent
2:11.
with Jesus's message.
Let's not ignore that one. Let's look at it. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not
I
permit a
think
woman
me-
to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. How do you take that verse?
I think I feel kind of baited and switched. You seem to be interested in my perspective and having
Your
me on
beliefs,
podcast.
100%. That's the entire thing. I want to know your beliefs and why you believe them.
No, but you're telling me that I'm wrong and that my beliefs aren't good enough for you.
I'm saying
And
I don't
it's kind of-
understand yet. You haven't said anything that
It's not.
answers the question. That's where we're at.
I have said things; they're just not good enough for you.
Right, because they
I
don't make
have
any
explained.
sense. When you
Okay,
pile
you're
them
saying
on,
my perspective doesn't make sense. So why the heck did you invite me on here?
so I can understand it.
You're not interested in understanding.
I am.
You
I'm
are
asking you
listening to what I am
specifically.
saying
I'm
and then telling me why I'm wrong.
Specifically asking you.
And so I
what do
feel
you
like-
think of this? I'm trying to understand. What do you think of this?
What do I think? I have a whole series on those problematic verses that goes to, what was it? First Timothy, which one? Did
1
you give
Timothy
me?
2:11 through 14. Yeah, let's discuss it then. If you got videos, you should, be up.
I don't have videos. I have theologians come and they talk to me about this.
Oh,
And I'm not a
Well,
theologian.
what are your
and
thoughts
I don't
on it?
pretend to know about anything. I'm trying to get to that verse, sir. First Timothy,
2.
there's several of those problematic verses. And so I would like, is this the one about submission or is this the one?
The one I just read. Yeah, it's a woman should learn in full quiet and learn quiet separation. 1 Thessalonians 1:7-9. This will happen when Jesus is revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. He will punish those who do not know Yahweh. That's me. And do not obey the gospel of Jesus. They will be punished with everlasting destruction. Now, when I hear everlasting destruction, I don't think of separation from Yahweh, because right now I'm separated from Yahweh. I'm separated from Jesus. I'm separated from the Holy Ghost. None of them have anything to say with my life whatsoever. They don't lead me. They don't guide me. They don't live inside me. And I'm okay. It's not destruction. I don't feel torment. I don't feel like I'm burning. So what I see when I see these verses, fiery furnace, weeping and gnashing of teeth, when I see these verses, I think of something a little bit different than the separation of God. Because as of right now, I'm separated from God. And it's not very hot. Well, actually, it's really hot. I live in Vegas. So
Yeah.
besides that.
Yeah, there's like I would push back on that a little bit.
I don't mean to offend. I don't mean any of this is insulting.
I
It's just
think you
very
do.
confusing to me.
I do think you mean to offend.
Doesn't make
but
any
that's
sense.
okay.
Well, that's weird.
That's fine. You do. You
I
mean to
don't.
be offensive. You mean to be offensive.
Which part
It's
was meant to be
okay.
offensive, Wendy?
You're being offensive.
Which part?
You're
Wendy?
being offensive.
Right now,
And
Wendy. I'm asking questions. You're accusing me of something, and I wanted to know when.
oh, you've accused me of quite a lot. You've accused me of quite a lot of stuff.
I'm not sure what I accused you of,
I'm
but
just not sure where we're going to go
all right.
on this, but I appreciate the conversation. I wish
I
you well.
appreciate the time as well and
I
the
hope that
conversation.
I will pray that God reveals himself in a new way to you so that you can see and experience what I
Still
feel,
waiting.
because yep, if your heart is not open to it, there's no way. There's
That's not
no
true.
way.
That's not true. Saul's heart
Okay.
was not open to Yahweh, and Jesus
Okay.
revealed himself to him. Did he not?
I'll give you that. I will give you that.
So
Absolutely.
therefore, why?
Sure, I
Why is he
recant that.
waiting? Yeah.
I'll go.
All right. Well,
I can't
pray that
imagine
I
why.
have a Saul moment or something.
I will. I absolutely will. I know
Let's see if that
that's
works.
like
I've got
so
a lot of people good.
patronizing for you, but that's okay.
Well,
I
yeah.
appreciate being on the receiving end of all
I
this.
appreciate
That's great.
I appreciate the time.
When I hear, that's just one example. When I hear
No,
a story
yeah.
like that, I'm like, that's how things work.
That's
it
one
sucks
way
that
to,
it's like
to
that.
interpret the hermeneutics of it, of course. But
Totally.
when you dive down into these other specific, Jesus wants his disciples to hate their family. If that's Luke 14:26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Why would Jesus, specifically Jesus, the happiest little guru on the planet, why would he want you to hate anybody? First off, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And let alone your own family, your wife, your kids. Why would Jesus want you to hate your wife and kids?
See, again,
And I'm gonna tell you, keep going hard. And the next person sitting here, anybody watching this, listen to me. Don't come here lightly. Listen, don't come here not ready. Mike wasn't playing. He didn't tell me none of this. I'm listening. And listen, y'all gonna watch this to the end. Listen, Mike didn't tell me what was going on here, and it was no setup. So what I love is that everything you just watched from him is genuine. And trust me, I was sitting there like, okay, all right, listen, I'm gonna rock out with it. But anybody that has a Spider-Man on their microphone will always be cool with me. So at the end of the day, please understand this. Faith is faith to what you think, but never feel disrespected when somebody questions your faith or your reason behind your faith. I love the fact that Mike pressured me tonight, because that pressure makes me now have to consider where I'm at. And if it hit solid ground, maybe I'll go back and look at things differently, or maybe my conviction got even stronger tonight. Only the future will tell. So Mike, I appreciate you.
I appreciate you, man.
Tonight.
Where can we find your stuff?